The first year you're preoccupied with all the details, and the second year it's like, so this is what my life is like. And so I always talk about grief, giving people permission to take care of themselves in that grief. And sometimes grief even looks like relief. And that will be the case sometimes, as in this case with the woman whose last years of her life were just so traumatic for her family. There is a sense of relief sometimes when life and love have been complicated. And I find that when I tell people that, it kind of opens up gates and opens up doors and opens up things for conversation. I always invite the family to be gentle with themselves and to keep the stories alive. Do everything they can to keep the stories alive. That line that you may have heard, I always use this line that the stories are important to hold them in your hearts for as long as we have memory, because that's where we carry the ones we loved. On the table, when you came in, there is a handout. Rachel Naomi Remen has written and spoken some wonderful things about grief, and I often use this one paragraph. Grieving is not about forgetting. Grieving allows us to heal, to remember with love rather than pain. It's a sorting process. One by one, you let go of the things that are gone and you mourn for them. One by one, you take hold of the things that have become part of you and you build again. So if you come to enough of my services, you begin to piece together things that I always try to include. And I tease people and say, you can do this for me now. You've heard me speak long enough that you can do this for me. But I think grief is really an important one. I also always acknowledge the hope that is ours through a relationship with Christ. Though at times it is more oblique than others. Sometimes it depends on the situation of the people and the family gathered. Sometimes it is a bare reference. And sometimes I surprise myself and it's the whole content. It depends the sense that I have of what's needed from the family. Many families have children and grandchildren who are not comfortable with some of the ways we've used religious language in the past, to gloss over things, to paint things black and white, to exclude people, the way churches can sometimes spiritualize things. More of that at a time of death is not motivating for them. What is motivating for them is a sense of love and belonging. Diana Butler Bass writes that since the Reformation, the accepted method of church involvement has been believe, behave, belong. You believe the claims of the church, then you practice the behaviors that go along with being part of the church, worship, tithing, quilting, whatever those behaviors are. Then finally you're allowed to belong to the church. You believe, you behave, you belong. She points out that this order is not working anymore. Many people are not willing to believe or claim to believe specific doctrines or to behave in specific ways just to be allowed to be in church, part of a church. They don't necessarily even want to be part of a church in the first place. The emerging pattern, she says, is belonging, and then behaving, and then believing. So it's the belonging that draws people in, and then out of that then becomes the behavior, and then becomes the believing. So the challenge you face as you're planning the service is, how do you honor both the deceased and those present? How do you plan a welcoming service? How do you plan a service that breaks people open to want to be a better person, want to live a better life, and want to sort of take steps into healing in their own life? That is, that's good. I have become apologetic in saying that a person's story is where I start, and that it's front and center. Did I say unapologetic or apologetic? Unapologetic. I'm unapologetic. I used to apologize. I don't anymore. Because I believe that we are evidence of God present, the hands and feet of Christ. No matter how imperfect, we end up living that out. And we meet God through each other. We know who God is through each other. People present mostly respond to honesty, and so begins the belonging. A family afterwards will often thank me for the chance to talk in a safe place, to remember. I have a file overflowing with notes from family thanking me for the care and personal attention and for the healing that has begun. As I was preparing for today, I was forced to look at my tendency toward telling the story of the person who died. As I read through some of my more memorable resident meditations, I fell in love over and over again with each resident I participated in a service for as I read their stories. Each one made me want to be a better person, a more faithful person. I counted out how many funerals I've done I've done them more intensely the last 3 years, 4 years, but I've been doing them in various forms. So I came up with between 150 and 160 names of people that I have participated in their services. And that includes my 2 brothers, and my father and my mother-in-law. And I believe it's a time to make every word count. As I shared with my 2 widowed sisters-in-law that I was going to do this, they took me out for an intervention last week. They thought I was working too hard. They took me out. And they both said, don't forget the humor. The humor, particularly the younger of my 2 brothers died just a year ago, a little over a year ago. And the humor that I brought to that service, he was a really stubborn, tenacious man. And I was able to bring that in a playful way, and my sister-in-law said to me last week, she said, that was so healing to be able to laugh. To be able to laugh. You know, he, as imperfect as his life was, his life was the testimony. His life was that. She said, we had the best time laughing. It was so Steve. And for months and months and months afterwards, people approached me and told me how that service had led them to reevaluate their life and how they lived their time. And I love God's sense of humor with me. Even as I wrote the words I was going to share today, I shared in a funeral on Monday, and the preaching pastor did the best job I have ever experienced of calling people to salvation in Jesus Christ. He did it in a way that was surrounded by her story and that was appropriate for her, and it was gentle, and he nailed it. And instead of leaving feeling like I had been trapped, and I left feeling like, yeah, that was good. And even as I was talking to Larry and Ann about coming, this was a couple of months ago, and I was spouting off about what I liked and what I didn't like about funerals, I sat in the most amazing meditation by a pastor who talked about heaven and what the experience of heaven is like. And I love being surprised by something that's not expected. The gentleman I shared the service with on Monday was a care pastor of a large Baptist church. And we were just connecting in. He'd been on vacation in Florida, so we hadn't had a chance to plan it together, and I was really feeling off balance, and I said, what are you talking about? And he said, and he said, if I know there's going to be a lot of family sharing, I don't do as much personal sharing in my meditation and base it more on Scripture. If I know that the sharing is going to be somewhat limited, I base my meditation on the story of that individual. And that was a good marker for me. I've seen changes in how funerals and memorial services are being done. More graveside services, less open sharing. It's more often a person or 2 will share, and passing around the mic is happening less and less, and we actually encourage them not to do that. Less focus on scripture-based meditations, more on story. Alternate settings. I'm on call to do a blessing in a restaurant when the gentleman dies, of gathering of close family and friends. This man lived a life of deep faith and connection to the church, helped start a thriving Baptist church, but his desire for his memorial was to keep it intimate. And I think that's the key, is in create whatever you do, is creating a sense of intimacy, whether it's with 12 people or whether it's with 200 people. The trick is to create a sense of intimacy. And do I ever worry that I've gotten it wrong? Do I ever worry that in my listening I didn't get it right? And of course I do. And there may have been a time or two when I have not gotten it right. Yeah, it is what it is. There are some resources on the table you can look at again and you can take, and I do have a couple of stories that I use on occasion, especially if I don't know someone at all or depending on what their life situation. One is called Death in a Nut. Death in a Nut. A story about a little boy who wants to, his mother's about to die and he wants to cancel death. And so he finds the Grim Reaper and he imprisons him in a nut. And what happens when there is no death? Good story. Another one I've considered telling today but don't have time is called Nadia the Willful, about a little girl, a Bedouin, in a Bedouin community whose her favorite brother, her father's favorite son, goes off to find water and never comes back. And so he decrees never to have his name spoken again. And what happens when the name of one who's died is never acknowledged again? Good stories. Not necessarily for telling in a service, but for just sort of, yeah, I've used them on occasion. All right, I need to stop. I have